Vacation for each person is a matter of purely individual in terms of what it is. Someone likes reckless partying in clubs or at home, in the company of friends and strangers, where alcohol pours in rivers, and sometimes there is something stronger. And someone prefers the peace and quiet of nature away from the bustle of the city and the unceasing hum of human voices. I belong to the second category. Although I have been on noisy pisca, but nothing but a headache in the morning and memory lapses from the amount of alcohol that was drunk, they did not bring me. But a vacation in the countryside in silence and solitude on the contrary helped to recover quite well. The long weekend was approaching, as the holidays overlapped on Saturday and Sunday, and, therefore, I had the opportunity to spend 4 whole days at my own pleasure and have a rest from the tedious work in the office and never silent colleagues. I decided to prepare in advance because I had already decided that I was going to be alone and just relax, watching movies and TV series, which I had downloaded on my tablet, but I had no desire to sit in my city apartment. So I decided to find a small house outside the city and rent it for the upcoming weekend. Given that I also liked fishing, the presence of a pond or river was a must. After searching several websites with ads for renting country houses, I came across one offer that I found very interesting. The potential landlord offered to rent a 1-story Finnish log cabin in the forest. The questionnaire indicated that the house is located at a solid distance from any buildings, and there is a clean pond nearby. Photos of the pond were attached. It was really very beautiful, round and neat. Its banks were covered with thick and lush grass, neat, clean and good pier, from which you can easily descend into the water or sit on it with a fishing rod. Having seen the pond, I made a decision about where exactly I will go, especially the price of 2,000 rubles for a day's rent per person, very pleasantly surprised because I was just alone. And finally, the long-awaited Wednesday, my dudes, which thanks to the holidays turned from a small Friday into a real Friday. The rent was paid, and it was only necessary to survive the last working day of the week, and we could move out. I decided to go tonight, not to lose a precious day of rest, and to check what kind of fish were in such a neat and beautiful pond on Thursday morning. The process of collecting things took a little time, as I took only a change of clothes, a tube in which there were 2 spinning and telescopic rod for float fishing, already pre-packed box with gear, a set of the same pre-purchased provisions and alcohol, but how without it, and a tablet with hundreds of gigabytes of series and movies. Coming home from work, I quickly changed from a business suit into jeans, a t-shirt and sneakers, grabbing a bag with food, and throwing over one shoulder a tube with fishing rods, and over the other backpack, which had a change of clothes and a tablet with a couple of power banks, and all at once went down to the car, which was standing in the yard. Throwing things into the trunk of my sedan, I slammed its lid and sat down in the driver's seat. Starting the engine, I finally set off on the road under the monotonous voice in the navigator, which was my faithful navigator. The road took about 3 hours, an hour of which I drove on a dirt forest road, good thing that it was quite smooth and allowed to drive more or less normally. Finally, the very log cabin that the landlord was talking about showed up. After payment, he explained that the keys to the house would be in a small metal basket, which was screwed to the wall of the house near the front door. On the lid of the basket was installed a code lock. The code for it was 1772. It was given to me as soon as the payment was made. Mentally surprised at such an original but convenient system of handing over the keys, I began to accommodate myself. Entering the house, I found myself in a small kitchenette, which was at the same time a hallway. On the right wall was a standard wooden square table, and on the left was a door that led to the room for the tenants. At the end of the kitchen, and directly opposite the front door, was another door that led to the pantry. After dumping the stuff in the residence room and scattering the food in the small refrigerator, I walked around the house and paid attention to the time. It was already 10:30 p.m., and I was tired. The combination of the day's work and the 3-hour drive on a not-so-easy road made me forget everything and just collapse on the bed as soon as I entered the house. Since it was the end of spring and the daylight hours had already lengthened considerably, it was still relatively light. However, this did not prevent me from falling into a deep sleep, but beforehand I had set the alarm clock for 5:00, as I was going to be in time for the morning catch. The alarm clock did not have to persuade me to get out of bed for long, as I had to go not to the stuffy office, but to a clean, and as I hoped very fishy pond. After a quick breakfast and a mug of coffee, I grabbed the tube that stood in the corner by the wall near the front door. My gear bag was already slung over my shoulder and headed towards the pond. As the owner of the house explained, it would take 5 minutes to get to the pond by following the path that started right behind the house and not turning around. It was supposed to lead to the pond. Bypassing the house, I immediately saw a small path about 30 centimeters wide, trampled in the thick grass. It was one and only, and there were no branches from it, so I walked briskly to the reservoir. It was in a small clearing, which was fenced on all sides by a dense deciduous forest. The pond itself turned out to be much more beautiful than on the photos. It was perfectly round in shape. Admittedly, I had never seen such a thing, and the first thought in my head was that it was man-made, because I did not believe that nature would have created such a perfect shape. It felt as if it was literally circled with a giant circular. But who would dig a pond, and even bother with its shape so much, far away from human settlements in the deep forest? It was not a fish farm. The banks of the pond were not made of clay and silt as usual, but consisted of ordinary earth, which was very unusual. It turns out that the clay layer was under the layer of soil, otherwise, the water would have simply gone through the soil, which unlike clay, was not a natural waterproofing agent. The water, by the way, was something else. It was so clear that it was 100 points ahead of any spring. On the surface of the pond there was not a trace of lilies or tina, with which such water areas are usually densely populated, and the banks were covered with grass about knee-high, and there was not a single sprout of reeds, which is strange, as they are very fond of such places. The diameter of the pond was about 10 meters. It was not big at all. The bottom was covered with a thick layer of algae, which were perfectly visible due to the absolute purity of the water. The depth at the shore was not great. Walking along the pier, which was about 3 meters long, and went not much less than the middle of the pond, I continuously looked into the water, and the depth slowly increased, but did not exceed even a meter. But when I passed 2 of the 3 meters of the pier, to my amazement, I noticed that the pond, which, as it seemed to me, should not exceed a couple of meters deep, suddenly began to become sharply deeper, and so sharply that with each step the depth added half a meter. The slope into the pit was very steep. Reaching the edge of the pier, despite the absolute purity of the water, I could hardly see the bottom. It was still covered with these neat green algae, which were a mixture of different plants, about a few tens of centimeters high. According to my personal feelings, the depth was about 5 or 5.5 meters, but the most striking thing was that it kept increasing, and the bottom was no longer visible. Having seen enough of such an unusual sight, I took off the lid of the tube and took out a floating rod. From the side pocket I took out a special stand for it, which did not need to be poked into the ground, but could just put, as it had a special footrest for this purpose. I laid out a telescopic rod, which was 6 meters long, and itself was more than half the length of the pond. I pulled the float on the line to the top of the rod to the end of the rod, setting the depth at more than 5 meters, and then set the rod so that its handle was at the entrance to the pier, but even so it continued to protrude for the same length as the pier, and the float was not even in the middle of the lake, but even further away. I used small earthworms as bait, as it was probably one of the most versatile baits. I expected to catch a few crucian carp, but I hoped that I would be lucky. And there is a tench here. Of course, it is much more difficult to catch it than crucian carp, but this fish in all aspects, starting from its fighting qualities as a trophy and gastronomic as an ingredient, do not compare with crucian carp. Then I took out a spinning, decided to take a lightweight with a test of 5 to 15 grams, as I did not count on the trophy, against which will require a powerful rod, putting the reel, passing the fishing line through the rings, and tying the leash. As there are probably pikes, well, or at least pike, I put a small trolling rod, as they are also very versatile, and began to scour the reservoir, throwing from the shore to the center. But there were no nibbles. So continued for about 2 hours, and, although I got used to waiting for nibbles for a long time, but the fact that even the floating rod was silent was annoying, Usually in such reservoirs, there were a lot of small fish, which although could not swallow the hook, but periodically breaks the bait, which was visible on the float, but in this case the float was absolutely motionless, as if I threw the rod into the pool, where there was no fish. I was bored, and I decided to estimate what depth was in the center of the lake. If the rate of depth did not change, there should have been 10 meters not less, which for such a water area was simply prohibitive indicators. Having taken out a jig head and hooked it instead of a spinner, I carefully calculated the force of throwing and threw it exactly on the center. I decided to hang a jig weighing 40 grams, although the test of spinning allowed to equip the bait weight of no more than 15. I had enough experience to carefully throw the tackle even with such an overweight, and do not damage the blank rod, although in this case a special skill and did not require, as the throw was literally a couple of meters. The load with a characteristic bump fell under the water column, and I began to wait for the bait to sink to the bottom, but to my amazement, neither after 10 nor even after 30 seconds, I did not feel how the bait touched the bottom. It just continued to quickly go underwater, winding off the reel braided cord, so it lasted about a minute. Looking at the spool of the reel, I was just stunned. You could see its base, which opened up because the cord was wound up almost completely, but there was 100 meters of cord on it. That is, in the center of this body of water was a natural well more than 90 meters deep. I began to reel in the tackle, but it was worth it to me to make a dozen turns of the reel handle, as I felt something sharply yank the tackle on itself, so it happens during a bite. I automatically made a hook, and then began to try to fish out the mysterious catch, but the tackle just did not move from the place, and any attempts to force it led to the resetting of the cord friction. It was very similar to a snag, but I clearly remembered that I felt the characteristic for a nibble jerk. However, there was no movement or attempts of resistance characteristic of the caught fish. Having decided that it was a hook, I took off my shirt, wrapped it around my hand, then wrapped the cord around my hand several times, and began to methodically pull it on myself, constantly increasing the effort, trying to thus either unbend the carabiner leash or break the cord in the knot, as its strength was less than the main fabric. But suddenly, something yanked the cord with such force that I stood on the very edge of the pier, did not keep my balance and fell into the water. By the way, it was icy. Once I bathed in the baptismal font in one of the monasteries, so it was about the same. The water just burned its cold. It was about 5 degrees Celsius. Quickly orienting myself, I grabbed the edge of the pier with both hands and pulling up, so that my torso to the waist was above the pier, threw a leg on it, and then the second. Shocked at what had happened, I stared at the abyss that was this seemingly innocuous pond. When I came to my senses, I decided that fishing was enough for today, and started to pack up my gear. After I got home and had dinner, I started to think about what the hell had happened. I didn't believe in all sorts of monsters, but the fact that someone or something threw me into the water, I obviously did not dream. The day was spent watching TV shows, cooking, and just suffering bullshit. In the evening I made a fire and especially equipped for this purpose, and just looked at the stars, drinking wine and listening to music. But during the whole day I was still thinking about what happened on that lake. The next day I decided to study this mysterious water area more closely. Taking with me a second spinning with a test of 25 to 50 grams and cord 0.4, capable of withstanding on the break more than 50 kilograms, I again went to this pond. Putting the spinning on the pier, I decided to carefully walk around the pond and examine its banks. They were to some unnatural degree perfectly shaped. As I carefully examined the water along the shore, I noticed that there was not a single friar tadpole in the water, which usually swarm along the shore in small flocks, but there was nothing here, although given the water temperature it was not surprising. Having finished the inspection of the shore, I returned to the pier and decided to try again to throw the tackle into the abyss, but this time it was several times more powerful, and the cord on the reel was more than 200 meters. But throwing away the bracket and slightly taking the spinning behind my back, I never made a throw. I did not make it because I noticed how in the very center of the reservoir, something was floating. It was under the water column about a meter from the surface. Looking closely, I saw the outlines. Good thing I was wearing polarizing glasses, which leveled the solar glare from the water. Apparently it was a log. Straight, a little less than a meter wide, dark brown with a greenish cast about 3 meters long, the object hung above the surface of the abyss exactly in the middle of the pond. The first thing that came to my mind was that this was the thing I had hooked when I cast the lure to the bottom of the pond in the center, but I could not explain the reason for the jerk that threw me into the water. I wanted to take a closer look at this log, and I threw the tackle so that to hook it, I managed to do it only with the 5th attempt. Finally I felt the weight and saw how the massive log is slowly moving in my direction. Bringing it to the pier itself, I lifted it to the surface and began to examine it. The surface of the log was covered with a dense bark, which had already darkened from being underwater for a long time. Between the cracks in the bark was a thick bright green moss with a slightly purple cast. Such moss I had never seen before. Part of the surface was covered with a thick layer of algae. When I looked at one end of the log, I noticed that it was a bit strange. There was an even and neat crack that went from the very edge and somewhere up to the first third of the log. The depth of the crack was not visible, but it stood out very clearly against a background, which seemed strange to me. Suddenly the log began to go underwater again, despite the fact that the cord was in a strong tension. I straightened up and taking the handle of spinning with both hands pulled it to his side. The blank rod bent in half, and then I again with a monstrous force pulled down. Again that burning cold sensation. I immediately opened my eyes and looked down where the unfortunate log was, and, although my vision was blurred by the fact that I was underwater, I saw clearly how the part where the crack was slid apart like a giant maw, or rather it was. I stared at the monster, which looked like an ordinary log, until I was in the water. Suddenly I felt myself being pulled upwards with force. Coughing, I tried to regain my breath, but the pier below me was clearly the same pier from which the creature had dragged me into the water, and I looked up and saw a short old man in a ragged camouflage jacket with a double-barreled shotgun on his shoulder. Without saying anything, he took a step toward the edge of the pier and looked into the water, then grimaced. I turned around and looked into the water, and I must say that what I saw remained in my memory forever. The thing that a minute ago had been indistinguishable from an ordinary log now looked nothing like it. Its whole front part was one big black gaping maw, which was filled with many crooked, more like twigs, from a couple of centimeters to almost 30. What I first took for algae sprouting through the bark turned out to be something like fins. It clearly controlled them, and apparently used them to move around. It hung in the water column for a few seconds, and then began to slowly sink to the bottom. I looked at the old man again, and he calmly said, "My name is Mitrich, I am a local forester. My hut is a couple of kilometers from the house where you stayed. I heard that the new one had arrived, so I decided to check on him, and it seems that it was not in vain." Seeing the mute question in my eyes, the old man again calmly said, "Come on, we need a drink, and then I'll tell you everything." Mitrich and I reached my hut and went into the kitchen. He took the rifle off his shoulder and from a small duffel bag took out a vodka bottle. Despite the fact that my clothes were soaked with ice water, I was not cold. We sat down at the table. The old man put a couple of mugs on it and then poured half of each and screwed the cap on the bottle and put it between them. Silently I took a small sip and asked the old man if he knew what that thing was. He looked strangely out of the window and then said, "How can I tell if I know? For as long as I can remember, my grandfather warned me not to go to that lake, saying that there were too many people disappearing there, and told me about the strange creatures that dwell there and devour those who are not careful or too curious, disguised as snags and trees." I didn't believe it at first, as well as my peers, but we were young and foolish, so we decided to go to this unfortunate pond to look at these creatures. Cannibals. Came to the pond, and let's fool around throwing stones into the water and see what happens. But nothing happened. But then Vanka noticed a log lying on the shore, came up and put his foot on it like on a pedestal and started laughing, saying that old people scared us with monsters, but here it's just rotten driftwood. But before he could say anything, the driftwood opened its mouth and grabbed him by the leg. He began to shout and call for help, but we, as paralyzed by fear, we did not have time to move, and at once and crawled into the water with Vanya. Since our elders did not know where we went, we decided that we would lie saying that we were sitting at home, and Vanya decided to show off in front of us and go alone. In general, what these things are and where they come from I don't know, but I do know that they don't go beyond this pond, and to be safe it's better just to stay away. I immediately asked, then, who had built the pier and why. The old man replied that the owner of the house had done it, apparently to make the house better for rent. Then I asked, and whether there are often tourists here, to which Mitrich replied that unfortunately more often than I would like, but fortunately due to the fact that the water in the pond is icy, not many dare to swim. In general, most people go back. Having finished the contents of the glass, I slowly came to my senses, and thanking the old man for the rescue, offered him some money as a thank you, but he immediately refused and simply, throwing his gun on his shoulder, advised me to leave as soon as possible, and if possible, to warn others that this is not the best place for a vacation.